This boy claimed to be Martin Luther King Jr. in a past life, and it's one of the most chilling reincarnation cases in history. The year was 2012, a seemingly ordinary autumn in the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, a city steeped in the echoes of the civil rights movement, its streets having once vibrated with the impassioned pleas for justice delivered by its most famous son. Here, in a modest two-story house, lived the Miller family: David, a high school history teacher with a passion for American democracy; Sarah, a gentle librarian; and their vibrant, imaginative 6-year-old son, Elijah. Elijah was, by all accounts, a perfectly normal child. He loved superheroes, building towering structures with Legos, and the endless adventure of his backyard swing set. His laugh, a bright, unburdened sound, often filled their home, mingling with the scent of Sarah's Sunday roasts and the gentle rustle of leaves outside. The atmosphere of their home was one of warmth, intellectual curiosity, and a deep respect for history, particularly the pivotal role Atlanta had played in the fight for equality. David often spoke of Dr. King at the dinner table, recounting his speeches and sacrifices, though Elijah, usually more interested in whether his mashed potatoes resembled a mountain range, rarely seemed to pay much attention. Yet, subtle cracks had begun to appear in this idyllic facade. Small, almost imperceptible shifts in Elijah's behavior that, in hindsight, would reveal themselves as the first tremors of something profound. He developed an unusual aversion to certain injustices, even in the innocent world of kindergarten. A classmate unfairly blamed for a spilled juice box would ignite a fierce, almost adult-like indignation in Elijah, far beyond the typical childish squabble. He'd use words like prejudice and fairness with a gravitas that felt oddly out of place for a boy his age. Sarah noticed him drawing intricate, almost architectural sketches of buildings he'd never seen, structures that bore a striking resemblance to historic churches in the city. David, watching him play, sometimes saw a distant, contemplative look in Elijah's eyes, a wisdom that seemed to stretch far beyond his 6 years, as if he were remembering something just beyond his grasp. The way he held himself, too, occasionally shifted, a sudden straightening of his small frame, a posture of quiet dignity that would vanish as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the usual fidgeting of a young boy. The true disquiet began with words, whispers from the past that trickled into Elijah's innocent vocabulary. It started innocently enough. One evening, as David read a bedtime story about a brave knight, Elijah interrupted, his voice small but firm. "That's not how you change minds," he said, shaking his head. "You got to speak to their hearts, not just their swords." David chuckled, attributing it to an overactive imagination. But then came the nightmares. Not the typical monsters under the bed kind, but vivid, terrifying visions of crowds, angry faces, and the chilling sound of shattering glass. Elijah would wake up in a cold sweat, muttering fragmented phrases. Freedom. We must overcome. The mountaintop. One afternoon, while watching a documentary on the civil rights movement that David had left playing, a familiar image flashed across the screen: the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Elijah, who had been engrossed in a cartoon in the next room, suddenly appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide, a strange mixture of recognition and fear on his face. "That's my church," he whispered, his small finger pointing at the screen. "That's where I preached." David and Sarah exchanged a bewildered glance. They had never taken Elijah to Montgomery, nor had they ever discussed Dr. King's early ministry in such detail. "Elijah, honey, that's a very famous church," Sarah said gently, trying to gauge his reaction. "Dr. King used to preach there." Elijah shook his head, a frown creasing his brow. "No," he insisted, a touch of frustration in his voice. "I was Dr. King. I preached there. I helped people seek to walk together." The air in the room grew heavy, thick with disbelief and a nascent fear. David felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just a child's fantasy. There was an intensity, a certainty in Elijah's gaze that was profoundly unsettling. Over the next few weeks, the revelations became more frequent, more specific. Elijah would speak of the struggle and the dream with a passion that seemed to transcend his years. He mentioned specific events like the Montgomery bus boycott, detailing aspects that weren't common knowledge. He once corrected David on a minor historical detail about a march route, a detail David later verified with an obscure academic text. "They tried to stop us at the bridge," Elijah said, his voice dropping to a somber tone. "But we kept marching, we had to." He spoke of the fear, the courage, and the unwavering conviction that fueled the movement, not as if he had learned it from a book, but as if he had lived it. The parents, initially dismissive, then concerned, began to feel a profound sense of unease. Sarah found herself constantly on edge, her maternal instincts warring with the inexplicable. David, the rational historian, felt his intellectual framework crumbling. How could a 6-year-old boy possess such intricate personal knowledge of a life lived decades before his birth? Then came the morning when Elijah, drawing intently at the kitchen table, suddenly looked up, his eyes filled with a sorrow beyond words. "I miss Coretta," he said, his voice barely a whisper, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. "And my children. It was a good life, until it wasn't." The revelation hung in the air, a chilling echo from the past. David and Sarah could no longer rationalize it away. This wasn't just a child with a vivid imagination. This was something extraordinary, something that defied every logical explanation. The name Coretta Scott King, the wife of Martin Luther King Jr., was not one a 6-year-old should know, let alone mourn. The emotional weight in Elijah's voice, the genuine grief, was palpable. The family's private struggle soon became a matter of public fascination. After months of trying to find a rational explanation, David and Sarah, desperate for answers, reached out to Dr. Eleanor Vance, a renowned child psychologist specializing in cases of childhood precocity, and Dr. Benjamin Carter, a historian from Emory University, a leading expert on the civil rights movement. They arrived with a healthy dose of skepticism, their professional reputations at stake. Their investigation began with gentle interviews. Dr. Vance observed Elijah's demeanor, his play, his interactions. Dr. Carter, armed with binders of historical records, posed questions that no child could possibly answer. He showed Elijah photographs of various civil rights leaders, asking him to identify them. Elijah pointed to a young Dr. King. "That's me," he stated simply. When shown a photograph of a different, lesser-known activist, Elijah correctly identified him, adding a small anecdote about his bravery during a sit-in, an anecdote Dr. Carter later confirmed was a little-known historical fact. They brought out maps of Selma, Montgomery, and Atlanta, asking Elijah to trace routes of marches, to identify specific buildings. With an uncanny accuracy, the boy's small finger navigated the historical landscapes, pointing to churches, homes, and even specific street corners that held significance in Dr. King's life. "This is where we planned the march," he'd say, tapping a finger on a particular spot in Montgomery. "And this street, that's where I lived for a while." Dr. Carter, his academic skepticism slowly eroding, tried to trip him up. He presented a photograph of a room, a study filled with books and a desk. "Do you know this place, Elijah?" he asked, expecting a blank stare. Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Of course, my study. It was always a mess, too many books, too many papers." He then added with a wistful smile, "Coretta always tried to organize it for me." Dr. Carter later confirmed that the photograph was indeed a rarely seen image of Dr. King's personal study, and friends of the family had often joked about his cluttered workspace. The psychologists observed that Elijah rarely spoke of Dr. King in the third person. It was always I or we, as if he were recounting his own experiences. The mid-story CTA. If this shocks you so far, subscribe and tell us in the comments what you think about reincarnation. The climax of their investigation came during a visit to the King Center in Atlanta. As they walked through the exhibits, Elijah was calm, almost serene, as if revisiting a familiar place. He pointed to a display case containing Dr. King's Bible and a worn sermon notebook. "That's my Bible," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "And those are my words." Then, without any prompting, he described a specific handwritten note in the margin of a particular sermon, a theological musing about the nature of justice and love, a note that was so faint it was barely visible, known only to a handful of archivists who had meticulously catalogued the collection. Dr. Carter, his jaw slack, could only confirm the existence of the note. But the most breathtaking moment occurred when they stood before a large photograph of Dr. King's crypt. Elijah, his small hand reaching out as if to touch the stone, suddenly looked up at David, his eyes brimming with an inexplicable sorrow and a profound sense of recognition. "They never found my other watch," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The gold one. I kept it hidden behind the loose brick, near the fireplace in the study. I wanted my son to have it." The statement sent a jolt through everyone present. David looked at Dr. Carter, who immediately understood the implication. The existence of a gold watch was completely unknown. It was a detail so specific, so personal, so utterly impossible for a child to fabricate or even stumble upon. Within days, a small discreet team with permission from the King Center and the Miller family was dispatched to the preserved study of Martin Luther King Jr., the very room depicted in the photograph Elijah had identified. With meticulous care, they examined the fireplace, and there, behind a loose brick, just as Elijah had described, they found it. A small, tarnished gold watch, its inscription worn but legible, bearing the initials MLK. The revelation was devastatingly irrefutable. It was a physical, tangible link, a piece of evidence that transcended historical records and psychological theories. The world, it seemed, had just witnessed an impossible proof. The aftermath of Elijah's case sent shockwaves far beyond the quiet suburbs of Atlanta. News channels carried the story. Documentaries were produced, theologians debated, scientists struggled for explanations, and historians re-examined their understanding of human consciousness. The Miller family, once anonymous, found themselves at the center of a global conversation about life, death, and the very nature of existence. Elijah, still a child, continued to live his life, though now with a profound legacy resting on his young shoulders. He still played with Legos, but sometimes, when injustice flared on the playground, a quiet resolve would settle in his eyes, and he would speak of the beloved community and the fierce urgency of now. The case of Elijah Miller challenges everything we thought we knew. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable, the unexplained, the possibility that memory, identity, and even the soul can transcend the boundaries of a single lifetime. It asks us to consider whether the human spirit truly ends with the last breath, or if it merely transforms, taking on new forms, carrying the echoes of a past life into the present. What do you think? Could this child truly be the reincarnation of Martin Luther King Jr.? Comment below and subscribe for more chilling cases.